Morning in New York. The lights inside NBC's Studio One come on long before the sun rises. Outside, the city is still quiet. Inside, producers move quickly, coffee cups in hand, scripts being revised one last time. And for years, millions of Americans started their day the exact same way. Savannah Guthrie sitting behind that desk. Calm, steady, familiar. Her voice was part of the morning routine. The headlines, the interviews, the reassuring sense that someone was guiding the day's first conversation. But recently, something changed, because the woman who spent years delivering the news suddenly became part of a story no one expected. And it wasn't the kind of headline she ever wanted. From the outside, Savannah always appeared composed, confident, the definition of professional calm under pressure. Viewers saw a polished broadcast journalist who seemed unshakable no matter how heavy the news cycle became. But the quieter truth was unfolding far away from the cameras. Behind the scenes, Savannah Guthrie had been dealing with something deeply personal, something that could have changed her career overnight. In 2016, during a playful moment at home, a toy accidentally struck her eye. The impact caused serious damage to her retina. For most people, it would have been frightening. For a television anchor, whose work depends on reading, seeing, and performing live on camera every morning, it was terrifying. In interviews later, Savannah acknowledged just how uncertain that moment felt. Multiple procedures followed, recovery was slow, and the possibility of long-term vision problems was very real. But the injury wasn't the only challenge. People close to the show have quietly suggested the pressure had been building for years. Early mornings, constant news cycles, the emotional weight of delivering difficult stories day after day. And, eventually, some of that strain began to show. Before we go further, a quick question for you. If you've watched The Today Show over the years, what Savannah Guthrie moment do you remember most? Her big headline-making interviews, or those quieter conversations that made the show feel personal? Savannah Guthrie's story didn't begin in a television studio. It began much farther away. She was born in Melbourne, Australia, where her father was working at the time. But she didn't spend much of her childhood there. The place that truly shaped her was thousands of miles away in the American Southwest. Tucson, Arizona. Wide skies, dry desert air, a quieter pace of life than the media capital she would one day inhabit. Friends from those early years often described Savannah as thoughtful and serious, even as a child. Her family valued education, faith, and discipline, things that would quietly shape the way she approached every step of her future career. She was the kind of student teachers noticed, curious in class, prepared, focused. Not flashy, not trying to be the center of attention, just determined. But when Savannah was 16 years old, something happened that changed the direction of her life in a way no teenager is prepared for. Her father died suddenly. The loss hit hard. In later interviews, Savannah has spoken about how disorienting that period felt. At an age when most teenagers are still figuring out who they are, she suddenly had to process a kind of grief that forces people to grow up quickly. Friends later recalled that something shifted in her during those years. She became more serious, more driven. Grief has a strange way of doing that. For some people, it creates distance from the future. For others, it creates urgency. Savannah chose the second path. Instead of drifting through those late teenage years, she threw herself into school. Structure became a kind of stability. Achievement became something she could control when life itself had proven unpredictable. That focus eventually led her to the University of Arizona. There, Savannah studied journalism. She wasn't yet imagining herself sitting behind the desk of one of America's most famous morning shows. At that point, she was simply building the skills of a reporter, learning how to ask questions, verify facts, and explain complicated issues clearly. She graduated with honors. And then she made a decision that surprised many people around her. Instead of immediately chasing a television career, Savannah chose a different path entirely. Law school. She moved to Washington, D.C., and enrolled at Georgetown University Law Center, one of the most respected law schools in the country. The shift might have seemed unusual for someone interested in journalism, but to Savannah, it made perfect sense. Understanding how the world works, especially the legal and political systems that shape it, mattered more to her than simply appearing on television. At Georgetown, she worked hard again, just as she always had. Eventually, she passed the bar and became a licensed attorney. For a time, that looked like it might be her future. Courtrooms, legal analysis, a very different kind of professional life than the one viewers would later associate with her. But in hindsight, that legal training would become one of Savannah Guthrie's greatest advantages when she finally did step in front of the camera. When she interviewed political leaders, Supreme Court experts, or legal analysts on television, she wasn't just reading questions from a script. She understood the law behind the headlines. She understood the stakes, and audiences could sense that. Still, at that moment in her life, the path forward was far from obvious. She had built a solid career foundation. She had credentials that could carry her far inside the legal world. But something inside her kept pulling in another direction, because becoming a lawyer wasn't her final destination. Soon, Savannah Guthrie would make a decision that surprised almost everyone around her. She would walk away from the legal career she had worked so hard to build, and take a risk that almost no one saw coming. Savannah Guthrie didn't walk out of law school and step straight onto national television. The path there was much slower and far less glamorous. Like most journalists, she began at the bottom. Her early television work happened in local newsrooms, the kind where the audience is small and the hours are long. She worked at stations like KMIZ in Missouri and later KVOA in Tucson. These were not the polished studios viewers associate with national broadcasts. They were training grounds. Local news meant reporting on everything: court hearings in the morning, community events in the afternoon, late-night script writing, early morning edits. Sometimes the same reporter had to research, write, and appear on camera all in one day. The pay was modest. The audiences were small, but the experience was invaluable. It was where Savannah learned the rhythms of television journalism, the timing of a live segment, the pressure of breaking news, the importance of explaining complicated stories in language ordinary viewers could understand. Still, moving from local news to national television is one of the hardest leaps in media. Thousands of journalists across the country are competing for a handful of roles at networks like NBC, ABC, and CBS. Most never make that jump. Savannah, however, had something unusual working in her favor. She wasn't just a journalist. She was also a trained lawyer. That combination gave her a unique voice when covering legal and political stories. While other reporters summarized events, Savannah could break down the underlying legal arguments. She could explain what a court ruling actually meant, not just what the headline said. Eventually, that expertise brought her to Washington, D.C. There, she joined NBC News as a legal analyst. At first, the role wasn't glamorous. She wasn't anchoring programs or leading major interviews. She was explaining court decisions, discussing constitutional questions, breaking down complicated legal developments for viewers who needed someone to translate the language of the law. Behind the scenes, colleagues noticed something about the way she handled those moments. She was calm under pressure, clear when discussing complicated issues, and unusually composed during live broadcasts. Still, at that stage of her career, very few people imagined Savannah Guthrie would become the face of one of America's most famous morning shows. According to people who worked inside the network at the time, her role was expected to remain focused on legal analysis. Important work, certainly, but far from the spotlight. There were moments when her career seemed likely to stay in that lane. Some reports later suggested that Savannah herself wasn't sure where the path would lead. Television can be unpredictable, and opportunities sometimes appear only briefly before disappearing again. But gradually, something shifted. Network executives began noticing how audiences responded to her. Viewers seemed to trust her explanations. Interviews flowed naturally. Even in tense political discussions, she maintained a kind of calm clarity that translated well on camera. In a business where trust is everything, that quality matters. And slowly, the opportunities grew. Guest hosting roles, more frequent appearances, bigger interviews. The shift didn't happen overnight, but over time, it became harder to ignore. Savannah Guthrie wasn't just a legal expert who could appear on television, she was someone viewers wanted to watch. That realization eventually led to the opportunity that would change her life: a seat at the desk of the Today Show. For millions of Americans, that desk represents the center of morning television, a place occupied over decades by some of the most recognizable figures in broadcasting. When Savannah stepped into that role in 2012, her career entered an entirely new chapter. The audiences were suddenly massive, the scrutiny constant, and the responsibility enormous. From the outside, it looked like the moment everything had finally come together. But fame, especially the kind that arrives with daily national television, comes with a price few viewers ever see. And for Savannah Guthrie, that cost was only beginning to reveal itself. When Savannah Guthrie officially joined the Today Show anchor desk in 2012, her career entered a completely different world. The Today Show is not just another television program. For decades, it has been one of the most watched morning broadcasts in America, a daily ritual for millions of viewers, starting their day with coffee, headlines, and conversation. Sitting behind that desk means something. It means you become part of people's routines, part of their mornings, part of how they understand the news. Savannah stepped into that role with a calm authority that audiences quickly recognized. Her background in journalism and law gave her interviews depth. Political leaders, legal experts, and public figures often found themselves answering questions from someone who clearly understood the stakes behind their answers. Over time, viewers began to associate her with stability, a steady presence in a world where the news cycle rarely slows down. But what viewers saw on camera was only one version of the job. Behind the scenes, morning television runs on an unforgiving schedule. Savannah's alarm often rang at 3:30 inches the morning. While most of New York was still asleep, she was already beginning the day. Producers would be finalizing scripts. Overnight developments had to be reviewed. Segments needed preparation. Interviews required briefing. The pace started before sunrise and didn't slow down once the cameras turned on. Every broadcast was live. Every conversation unscripted. Every mistake potentially happening in front of millions of people. Morning television leaves very little room for bad days. Viewers expect energy, clarity, and composure no matter what is happening behind the scenes. The audience rarely sees the exhaustion that builds when someone has been waking up before dawn for years. And Savannah rarely complained about that pressure. Colleagues often described her as intensely prepared. She studied briefings carefully, asked detailed questions during planning meetings, and treated even short segments as opportunities to inform viewers properly. From the outside, it looked like she handled the role effortlessly. But inside the building, everyone understood how demanding it was. Because morning television isn't just a job, it's a lifestyle built around a schedule most people would struggle to maintain. Still, Savannah kept showing up, day after day, year after year. And then, in 2016, something happened that no one inside the studio could have predicted. It started with an ordinary moment at home, a playful interaction between a mother and her young son. But in seconds, that moment turned into a medical emergency. A toy accidentally struck Savannah's eye, causing a serious retinal injury. Doctors soon began discussing the possibility of permanent damage to her vision. For someone whose career depends on reading, seeing, and performing live on camera, the situation was frightening. And yet that incident wasn't the only pressure building quietly in Savannah Guthrie's life. Because by the time the world entered one of the most difficult news periods in modern history, Savannah was already running on very little rest. Years of early mornings, a relentless news cycle, and a responsibility that grew heavier every day. When the pandemic arrived in 2020, those pressures would intensify in ways almost no television journalist was prepared for. And that's when the real cost of the job began to surface. In 2016, a moment that seemed completely ordinary changed everything. Savannah Guthrie was at home with her young son, Charlie. They were playing, the way parents and children do every day. At one point, a toy flew toward her face and struck her eye. At first, it didn't seem catastrophic, but very quickly, doctors realized something serious had happened. The impact had damaged her retina. For most people, an eye injury is frightening enough. But for someone whose entire career happens in front of cameras, someone who reads scripts, studies, notes, and maintains eye contact with millions of viewers every morning, the possibility of losing vision is something else entirely. It wasn't just a medical problem, it was a professional crisis. Savannah later revealed that doctors warned the injury could potentially threaten her eyesight if complications developed. The following months became a cycle of medical visits, procedures, and uncertainty. She underwent multiple surgeries to repair the damage. Recovery wasn't simple. Vision issues can be unpredictable, especially when the retina is involved. Some days she could see clearly. Other days were far more difficult. And yet, many viewers watching the Today Show at the time had no idea what she was dealing with behind the scenes. Savannah kept showing up. She sat behind the desk, delivered interviews, read headlines, maintained the calm presence audiences expected every morning. Only later, in interviews reflecting on that period, did she admit how frightening the experience really was. There were nights, she said, when she genuinely worried about whether her vision would fully recover. In those moments, she leaned heavily on the things that had always grounded her. Her faith, her family, her husband, Michael Feldman, became a steady source of support. Their children, Vale and Charlie, reminded her that the most important parts of life existed far away from television studios and broadcast schedules. Still, just as she was navigating that recovery, the world changed again. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic reshaped nearly every part of daily life. And suddenly, morning television carried an enormous new responsibility. Millions of Americans were waking up in uncertainty, searching for reliable information. Every broadcast became a mixture of breaking news, health guidance, economic anxiety, and human stories of loss. Savannah and her co-anchor Hoda Kotb were sitting at the center of that moment, day after day, sometimes delivering statistics that were difficult to process, sometimes interviewing doctors, government officials, or families affected by the crisis. The job required professionalism, clarity, and empathy at the same time. But the reality was that the anchors themselves were living through the same fears as everyone watching at home. They were parents. They had families. They were navigating uncertainty too. Over time, the cumulative pressure began to show. Fatigue is not always dramatic. It rarely arrives with a clear announcement. Instead, it appears gradually. Viewers began noticing occasional absences. Some mornings, Savannah wasn't behind the desk. Guest hosts stepped in. Producers explained schedules and rotations the way television networks usually do. But audiences who had grown accustomed to seeing her every day began asking questions. Because when someone becomes part of your morning routine for years, even small changes feel noticeable. And the truth was more complicated than any single headline. The real challenge Savannah Guthrie faced wasn't one moment, not the injury, not the pandemic, not even the relentless schedule. It was the accumulation of all of it. Years of waking up before sunrise, the emotional weight of delivering difficult news, health concerns that forced her to confront vulnerability in a profession that rarely allows it. Eventually, Like many high-achieving professionals, she reached a point where stepping back became necessary, not as a failure, but as a re-evaluation, a moment to ask difficult questions about balance, priorities, and sustainability. Because even the strongest people eventually reach limits. If you were in her position carrying that level of pressure for years, what would you have done? Would you have kept pushing forward no matter the cost? Or paused long enough to reconsider what really matters? But the story didn't end with exhaustion or burnout. In fact, stepping back gave Savannah Guthrie something she hadn't had in years: perspective. And that perspective would quietly change the way she approached both her career and her life. Stepping back, even briefly, has a way of changing how people see their own lives. For Savannah Guthrie, that period became less about headlines and more about reflection. In conversations and interviews that followed, she began speaking more openly about the parts of her life that existed outside the television studio: faith, family, balance. These had always been present in her life, but they began to take on a more visible role in the way she talked about her career and her priorities. Savannah has long described her Christian faith as something that grounds her, but during the more difficult seasons of her life, that belief system became something deeper, a framework for navigating uncertainty. In interviews, she sometimes spoke about how those quiet moments away from the camera helped her reset. Because the truth is that a career like hers can easily become an identity. When someone wakes up at 3:30 inches the morning for years, sits in front of millions of viewers every day, and carries the responsibility of explaining the world's most complicated stories, the role can start to define everything. But stepping back forced a different kind of question. Not about ratings, not about the next interview, a more personal one. Who are you when the broadcast ends? Many high-achieving professionals reach that moment eventually. The job that once felt exciting begins to feel consuming. The schedule that once felt manageable starts to reshape the rest of life. Savannah Guthrie was no different. Looking back, her life seemed to follow a pattern that had been forming long before she ever stepped into a television studio. Early loss, hard work, responsibility arriving earlier than expected, and again, resilience. The loss of her father when she was 16 had already taught her something about endurance. Law school had taught discipline. Journalism had taught clarity under pressure. But the years of national television added another layer, learning how to stay human while living inside a role watched by millions. People close to the Today Show later described a subtle shift when Savannah returned more consistently to the anchor desk. Not dramatic, not obvious, but noticeable. She seemed calmer, more deliberate in the way she approached interviews, less focused on performing the role of anchor, and more focused on being present inside it. Colleagues said her questions became sharper, but also more empathetic. Instead of rushing through difficult moments on air, she sometimes allowed conversations to breathe. Interviews with political leaders, authors, and ordinary people affected by major events carried a slightly different tone. Still serious, still prepared, but more personal. That evolution is something audiences seem to recognize instinctively. Trust is a fragile currency in television journalism. Viewers can sense when someone is simply reading a script versus when they genuinely understand the weight of the stories they're telling. Savannah's background already gave her credibility. Her legal training allowed her to challenge powerful figures with precise questions. But the experiences she had gone through, the injury, the pressure, the reflection, added another dimension: empathy. She could sit across from someone describing loss, uncertainty, or struggle and understand the emotional layers beneath the headline. And perhaps that is part of why audiences continue to connect with her. Because behind the polished broadcast presence, behind the studio lights and professional delivery, there is a real person who has navigated fear, exhaustion, and difficult questions about what truly matters. Not perfectly, but honestly, and sometimes honesty is what viewers recognize most clearly. It reminds them that the people delivering the news are human too, that even the calmest voice on television may have fought quiet battles long before the cameras ever turned on. Early morning again. Inside NBC's Studio 1A, the lights slowly warm up. Producers move across the floor. Papers shuffle. Cameras adjust their focus. Outside, New York is just beginning to wake. Across the country, coffee machines hum in quiet kitchens. Phones light up with the first notifications of the day. Televisions flicker on in living rooms, where people are still shaking off sleep. And then the broadcast begins. There she is again, Savannah Guthrie, sitting behind the desk. Calm voice, steady presence. For most viewers, it might look like just another ordinary morning show. Headlines, interviews, conversations that ease people into the day. But the truth behind that familiar image is something quieter and far more human. Because every morning she sits in that chair represents a choice, a decision to show up, to keep going, to face another day of questions, cameras, and responsibilities, even after seasons that tested her strength in ways viewers may never fully see. Resilience rarely arrives with dramatic music or grand speeches. Most of the time it looks like this: someone returning to the same chair, doing the same work, day after day. If Savannah Guthrie's story reminds you of someone in your own life, someone who keeps showing up no matter what, leave a like as a small tribute to that quiet strength.